Thanks everyone for having me. My name is Andy Taylor, and as Dean said, I work for Congressman Michael McCaul from Austin, Texas. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the Andrea Sloan Compassionate Use Reform and Enhancement Act, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we prefer to call it the Andrea Sloan Cure Act. Our bill, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment, seeks to make some important improvements to a process at the FDA known as the compassionate use process. Some of you better know this as the expanded access process, two different terms that mean the exact same thing. In a nutshell, compassionate use refers to a situation in which a patient seeks access to a potentially life-saving drug that hasn't yet been approved by the FDA, and they do so outside of the clinical trial setting. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I want to start off by talking about Andrea Sloan, a woman photographed here, a constituent of Congressman McCaul's, who at age 45 unfortunately passed away from ovarian cancer, which she had battled off and on for about 7 years. Andrea was pretty fortunate, actually, as a patient to have gotten really some of the best care that someone could ask for. She was treated at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, which some of you may know is arguably the top cancer center in the country, if not the world. She had top-notch doctors, great insurance, supportive family and friends. But like too many patients, including patients in the rare disease community, she was told in 2013 by her doctors that she'd essentially run out of all FDA-approved treatment options. And there was really nothing left, given FDA-approved drugs, that they could do for her. So, like any patient, with the help of her doctor, Andrea tried very hard to get into a clinical trial, but she was just simply too sick to get into one. And so she struggled for a very long time to try to find a way to get access through that route, but was unfortunately unable to. So Andrea's doctors attempted something else. They attempted, as I mentioned, to access an experimental drug through the compassionate use process. Unfortunately, after several attempts in efforts to work with a drug company to get access to a drug, she was denied and several months later passed away. But over the course of time, as she tried to get access, she really mounted a very aggressive public campaign to get the company to reverse its decision. And we're seeing more and more of these cases out there. You may have read in the news about some other examples of patients that have really tried very hard to get access to an experimental drug, the Josh Hardy case, for example. So let me talk a little bit more about compassionate use and how it works and what our bill does to address that. So let's just start off with the basics. As I mentioned, compassionate use essentially is a process through which patients can get access to experimental drugs outside of the clinical trial setting. These are drugs that haven't been approved by the FDA. There are three basic categories. There's single patient requests. In Andrea's case, it was considered an emergency request. Intermediate sized groups of patients that try to seek access to a drug. This is basically anywhere from about 2 to 100 patients all trying to get access to the same treatment. And then treatment size requests or large size requests, which are 100 or more patients. And in all of these cases, you have basically two general criteria that have to be met for the patient to get access. First and foremost, their physician has to determine that the risk associated with trying the experimental drug does not outweigh the risk associated with their disease or condition. And then secondly, the FDA, which plays an important role in this process, has to determine that the patient can't get access to either another FDA-approved drug or that they can't get access to the drug that they're trying to seek in some other way, such as a clinical trial. So let me talk a little bit about the process. It's important to note, first and foremost, that it's really the companies, the drug companies, the drug sponsors, and not the Food and Drug Administration that makes the decision about who gets access and who doesn't. And that's true at least initially, because the FDA does play a very important role in the process here. They do have to sign off on a company's decision, and we'll see in a moment that they almost always do. An institutional review board, or IRB, also has to agree with the company and the FDA's decision. And then if a patient does get access to an experimental drug, their physician is required to report any what's called serious adverse events, such as an unexpected complication that arises in a compassionate use case. Those have to be reported to the Food and Drug Administration as well. And we're going to see in a moment why that is in and of itself a bit of a challenge. Let me show you a few of the numbers here. We've got two graphs up above that I think are pretty interesting in the context of compassionate use. The first one on our left here shows the number of compassionate use requests that were accepted by the FDA over the last 5 years. So going back to 2010 to 2013, you saw on average about 1,000 of these requests a year that went to the FDA. And then last year in 2014, we saw this dramatic increase in the number of requests, a 92% increase to almost 2,000 requests last year alone. The other thing that's important to point out is, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the second graph, this shows you over that same time period how many of those requests were approved by the Food and Drug Administration, and the number is about 99.5%. So the FDA rarely denies access to patients if the drug company has agreed to grant access in the first place. A few of the problems, though, that are associated with compassionate use I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we address those in a second. First and foremost is from the patient and doctor perspective, the process by which patients request access to experimental drugs through compassionate use can be very difficult to navigate. As I mentioned, it's really up to the drug company to agree to provide access to their treatment. And so what you have is hundreds of companies out there with hundreds of different policies, different levels of experience that those companies have gone through. With some companies have dealt with many compassionate use requests, and they have a system down, they know how to do it. A lot of other companies have never dealt with it before. They may not even have a drug out there on the market yet. And so it can be very hard to identify things like a single point of contact at the company that you can turn to request access. Hard to identify the procedures a patient would need to follow. The time frames can vary considerably from company to company. So these are all big challenges, and patients are really struggling, I think, right now to navigate this process. For the drug companies themselves, as I mentioned earlier, physicians have to report serious adverse events to the FDA, which, while I think is well intended, it poses some challenges for the companies. Right now, companies don't really know what the FDA does with this information, and it's producing a kind of lack of regulatory certainty that in some cases I think is actually causing many companies to adopt a policy of zero access under any circumstances. They just don't want to deal with the hassle. They're worried what will happen if the FDA decides that they're going to put their drug on clinical hold, if the drug approval process is going to be delayed, or worse. And so that regulatory uncertainty is really actually having a trickle-down effect on the patients themselves for the companies that decide that they just would rather not have to deal with compassionate use at all. Then for policymakers, we have our own challenges. Right now, we really have very limited information about how well this process is working at the FDA. I showed you a couple of graphs a moment ago that showed the number of requests that the FDA has accepted over the last few years. I do think these numbers are somewhat misleading, though. We really don't know how many requests are out there like Andrea Sloan's. Requests that go to companies and then there's no follow-up, or the company denies them outright before these requests ever make it to the FDA. So we don't know, are there tens of thousands of patients out there that seek access each year, hundreds of thousands? We have no sense, and we really don't know what kinds of patients are most likely to request access. We have, I think, some theories. I think the rare disease community is probably among those that are most likely to seek access to an experimental drug through compassionate use, because there is such difficulty developing rare disease drugs, but we just don't know right now. So we have trouble identifying ways to actually make improvements to this process without that information. So I mentioned our bill is the Andrea Sloan CURE Act. CURE stands for Compassionate Use Reform and Enhancement. So let me talk a little bit about how our bill reforms the compassionate use process and enhances that process, really particularly for patients. So if you don't remember, there are 5 things our bill does. If you don't remember all 5, the first one is really the most important one, and I'm putting this up here. Our bill, first and foremost, requires companies developing the most innovative, life-saving treatments that fulfill unmet medical need to have publicly accessible compassionate use policies. This is really critical. As I mentioned, there's a hodgepodge of companies out there that have different levels of experience, different information they provide patients. We know that the patients that I think have the easiest time navigating the process are the patients that are seeking access from companies that have policies that have been thought out, clearly identified or articulated. So our bill would require companies to have publicly accessible policies with a few important things, such as a single point of contact patients can turn to request access, procedures, a timeline, what sort of eligibility criteria a patient would need to meet. This is really the centerpiece of the bill right here. So if you remember nothing else, remember that we really seek to have more companies make their policies publicly accessible. We also require companies to notify patients if they have been denied access through compassionate use and to provide patients with an explanation. We think that the only thing worse than for a patient to run out of treatment options completely is to run out of options and have no idea why you were denied access. We also ask the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which some of you may have heard about. It's kind of the watchdog arm of Congress. We ask them to do a very thorough analysis of the current program and try to get at some of those numbers that I mentioned that policymakers don't have right now, such as how many requests are out there and who's making the requests and what are the big barriers for patients and companies. We also established a task force made up of stakeholders from the FDA to the drug companies to the patient community. We actually have, out of 13 members on this task force, 2 would come from the rare disease community because we really think the rare disease community needs a seat at the table. And we would like to hear from them about other ways that we can make improvements to this current process. And finally, we asked the FDA to clarify how they take into consideration serious adverse events. This is the regulatory uncertainty I was talking about a moment ago. We really think it's important for the companies to have a better sense of how the FDA looks at this information so that companies can have a little more certainty and go out there and hopefully agree to work with patients to provide access when appropriate. So those are the 5 things our bill does. I know it's a little technical, a little wonky. I apologize for all the detail, but let me just end with a little more uplifting photo of Andrea Sloan. I started with frankly, a rather depressing one. That's not the image I want to leave you with. Andrea was a horse lover, an equestrian. This is her at a much better point in her life. Before she passed, she was working very, very hard, even up until the end, to find a way to improve the compassionate use process, and that's why we got involved in this effort. And I just want to point out that Andrea was not a big political contributor, something like that. She was just kind of an average person out there that was trying to make a difference given her difficult set of circumstances. I know a lot of you are in a similar place, and I just want you to know that advocacy does really matter in this context, and so we appreciate you being here and appreciate you taking the time to listen to me talk about this bill. Thank you.